In the way people interact with one another, there are two ideas that are often confused: protection and indulgence. Quite often, when we try to help someone, we believe that as long as our intention is caring, and as long as we're trying to prevent them from getting hurt, then we must be protecting them. But in reality, things are not always that simple. Sometimes, actions that appear considerate, tolerant, or supportive may actually allow a problem to continue. Over time, they may even cause someone to gradually lose the ability to face difficulties or take responsibility for their own choices. True protection means offering care while still maintaining clear boundaries. It allows a person to learn, grow, and develop within a safe environment. Indulgence, on the other hand, can quietly shift the consequences of someone's actions onto others, allowing them to avoid challenges they should really face themselves. If we fail to recognize the difference between the two, good intentions can sometimes lead to the opposite of what we hoped for. That is why understanding the difference between protection and indulgence is so important. It not only helps improve our relationships with others, but also encourages us to think more clearly about responsibility, personal growth, and fairness. Hi everyone, I'm Eric, a cat who dreams of becoming a philosopher. This is the place where I share my thoughts and explore new ideas with you all. So let's dive into today's topic. When people talk about protection, they often imagine stepping in to block danger, solving problems for someone else, or even taking responsibility for the consequences on their behalf. But true protection is not about removing every difficulty from someone's path. Instead, it is about offering support while a person faces reality, so they can gradually learn how to deal with the world without being overwhelmed. The essence of protection is not replacing the other person, but helping them build the ability to stand on their own. In other words, protection is not about making someone permanently dependent on others. It is about helping them grow stronger through support. One key feature of protection is the creation of a safe environment. When a person's abilities are still developing, being completely exposed to risk can lead to harm they are not ready to handle. Protection therefore involves limiting certain dangers, allowing someone to learn within more stable conditions. For example, in education and family life, adults often set rules for children to prevent them from encountering situations that are too dangerous. At the same time, they provide guidance and support when children try new things. This arrangement is not meant to stop children from exploring the world. Rather, it allows them to understand how the world works under safer conditions. A second important feature of protection is the presence of boundaries. Many people assume that protection means unconditional support, but in reality, genuine protection often includes clear limits. When someone behaves inappropriately, protection does not deny that a mistake has been made, nor does it pretend that nothing happened. Instead, it helps the person understand the possible consequences of their actions and, when necessary, encourages them to make changes. These boundaries are not simply punishments. They serve as guidance, helping people gradually understand the relationship between their behavior and its outcomes. Protection also involves companionship and support. When facing difficulties, people often need more than just answers. They need a sense of stability. When someone is willing to offer advice, listen to concerns, or simply remain present during difficult moments, these actions can all be part of protection. The important point is that this support does not replace the other person's responsibility. Instead, it allows them to retain their ability to make choices and take action. Another important aspect of protection is its long-term perspective. Protection is not only concerned with whether something feels comfortable right now. It also considers what will genuinely help a person develop over time. Sometimes this means accepting short-term discomfort. In certain situations, allowing someone to experience the consequences of their own actions may cause temporary frustration, but such experiences often help them make wiser decisions in the future. For this reason, protection is not simply about care or tolerance. It is about maintaining a balance between compassion and responsibility. It neither ignores difficulties nor completely replaces another person's choices, but instead provides support from an appropriate distance. When protection truly works, the person being protected does not become more dependent. Instead, they gradually develop greater confidence and capability. Ultimately, the goal of protection is to help someone gain the strength to face the world independently, rather than remaining in a state of being protected forever. Compared with protection, indulgence often appears in the same context of care and goodwill. Because of this, it is very easy in everyday life to mistake indulgence for kindness, tolerance, or understanding. Many people indulge others not because they do not care, but precisely because they do. They may not want to see the other person upset, they may wish to avoid conflict, or they may believe that taking on some consequences themselves will help keep the relationship harmonious. However, when this behavior becomes habitual, what began as goodwill can slowly change in nature, shifting from empathy and understanding into indulgence. The most central feature of indulgence is the repeated removal of consequences for someone's behavior. When a person acts irresponsibly or inappropriately, and someone else constantly covers up the problem, accepts the responsibility, or explains it away as reasonable, the mistake no longer carries any real impact. Over time, the connection between behavior and consequences becomes weaker. As a result, the person may gradually lose the motivation to change. In an environment where actions bring no real consequences, it becomes very difficult for someone to recognize that their behavior needs to be corrected. Indulgence is also often accompanied by the gradual disappearance of boundaries. Rules that were once clear may become blurred through repeated exceptions. When certain behaviors are repeatedly forgiven without any expectation of change, it becomes harder for people to understand what should actually be avoided. Eventually, what began as occasional problems may slowly turn into accepted habits. This kind of shift rarely happens suddenly. More often, it develops little by little through repeated compromises. Another common situation is when indulgence appears under the name of understanding. Understanding someone's situation is important because everyone faces stress or difficulties at different times in life. But when understanding turns into constantly making excuses for someone else, the situation can begin to drift away from its original purpose. For example, a lack of responsibility might be explained as excessive stress. Harmful behavior toward others might be justified as a moment of emotional loss of control. When every action can be rationalized, the areas that truly require change become much harder to see. Indulgence can also create dependency within relationships. When someone becomes used to others cleaning up the consequences of their actions, they may think less and less about their own choices. Experiences that normally help people grow, such as facing mistakes or correcting their behavior, may simply be skipped. In the short term, this might make life seem easier, but in the long run, it can weaken a person's ability to deal with challenges independently. When they eventually need to face problems on their own, they may feel unprepared and uncertain about what to do. Furthermore, indulgence can also affect the people around them. When some individuals do not need to take responsibility for their behavior, while others still have to follow the rules, the overall sense of fairness begins to erode. People may start to feel that the situation is unbalanced, and they may even question whether the rules still have meaning. If this continues, trust within the relationship can slowly decline. For these reasons, indulgence is not simply tolerance or compassion. It is a gradual process in which boundaries and responsibility are slowly abandoned within a relationship. It often begins under the appearance of kindness, but without awareness, it can allow problems to continue accumulating. While indulgence may seem to maintain peace on the surface, in reality it often makes mistakes far more difficult to correct over time. In everyday life, protection and indulgence can appear in very similar situations. For example, when someone makes a mistake, faces a difficulty, or behaves poorly under pressure, the people around them often feel the need to respond. Some responses may look like care and support on the surface. However, whether they are truly protective or actually indulgent is not always easy to judge at first glance. To understand the real difference, we need to look more deeply at how each approach deals with responsibility, consequences, and personal growth. One of the most important differences lies in how consequences are handled. Protection does not deny that consequences exist. Instead, it allows a person to face those consequences while receiving support. When someone makes a mistake, protection may involve offering advice, helping them reflect on the situation, or guiding them towards a solution. But the impact of the mistake is still acknowledged. Indulgence, on the other hand, tends to remove or hide those consequences. When mistakes are repeatedly softened, explained away, or erased, they appear to carry no real cost. Over time, this weakens the connection between actions and outcomes, making it harder for someone to understand why their behavior should change. Another key difference lies in the time perspective. Protection usually takes a long-term view. When people choose to protect someone, they often think about whether that person will grow in the future and develop the ability to handle life more independently. Because of this, protection may sometimes accept short-term discomfort. Allowing someone to experience the frustration that comes from a mistake can help them learn to deal with challenges more maturely. Indulgence, however, often focus on immediate emotions. If a particular response can quickly avoid conflict or reduce unpleasant feelings, people may be more likely to choose it, even if it creates problems later on. The roles people take within the relationship can also be quite different. Protection creates a supportive relationship. It provides resources, guidance, and encouragement, but it does not replace the other person's ability to choose. The person being protected still participates in decisions and still carries responsibility for their actions. Through this process, they gradually learn how to think, decide, and act for themselves. Indulgence can solely create a different pattern. In this pattern, one person ends up making decisions and handling consequences, while the other becomes increasingly used to relying on that arrangement. The presence or absence of boundaries is another important clue. Protection usually comes with clear boundaries. These boundaries define the limits of help. Support and advice may be offered, but responsibility is not completely taken away from the other person. Indulgence, however, often blurs those boundaries. Once someone begins repeatedly taking responsibility for another person's actions, it becomes easier to continue doing so. Over time, the boundaries that once existed may gradually disappear. Finally, the long-term outcomes of protection and indulgence tend to move in very different directions. Protection generally helps people build confidence and capability, because they learn to face reality with support. Indulgence, by contrast, can deprive someone of those opportunities. Problems may be delayed rather than resolved, and sometimes they slowly accumulate. On the surface, both protection and indulgence may come from good intentions. Yet when viewed from a long-term perspective, their effects can be completely different. In the end, the real difference between protection and indulgence is not simply the action itself, but the principles behind it. Protection maintains responsibility and boundaries even while offering care. Indulgence gradually lets those elements fade away. Understanding this distinction helps us make clearer and more thoughtful choices when we face similar situations in our own lives. When protection or indulgence continues within a relationship, their effects do not remain limited to the present moment. Over time, their influence gradually grows. Although both may sometimes appear to come from good intentions, their long-term impact on personal ability, relationships, and the wider environment can be very different. Understanding these effects helps us see more clearly where each approach may lead. When genuine protection is present, a person usually begins to develop the ability to deal with problems independently. This is because even while receiving support, they are still expected to recognize consequences, correct mistakes, and take responsibility for their actions. Through these experiences, people gradually build judgment and awareness. They begin to understand how their behavior affects others and the environment around them. Growing up or developing in a setting where support and responsibility exist together often leads to greater confidence, as well as a stronger willingness to take ownership of one's choices. Protection can also help create stable relationships. When clear boundaries and mutual respect exist, people are more likely to understand each other's roles and responsibilities. Even when conflicts arise, they can usually be addressed through communication and adjustment. Such relationships may not always feel easy, but they tend to remain stable over time because everyone involved understands that actions have consequences. By contrast, the effects of indulgence are often less obvious at the beginning. When problems are hidden or consequences are absorbed by someone else, it may appear that conflict and pressure have been reduced. On the surface, things seem calmer. However, as time passes, problems often begin to accumulate. When a person rarely needs to take responsibility for their behavior, they may gradually lose the motivation to correct it. At the same time, it becomes harder for them to recognize that a problem even exists. As a result, mistakes may be repeated again and again, and sometimes they grow more serious over time. Indulgence can also place pressure on the people around them. When some individuals are able to avoid responsibility while others must continue following the rules, the sense of fairness within the group begins to weaken. People may start to feel that the situation is unbalanced, and they may even begin to question the system or the relationship itself. If these feelings continue to build, trust can slowly decline, and cooperation becomes more difficult. In family environments, indulgence may leave children less prepared to deal with frustration. If a child becomes used to having someone solve every problem after a failure, they may feel lost when they eventually face challenges on their own. In contrast, children who grow up in an environment that combines protection with clear boundaries often develop a better understanding of the relationship between effort, failure, and improvement. In broader settings such as workplaces or social systems, indulgence can also weaken overall efficiency and fairness. When responsibilities become unclear, some people may end up carrying more pressure, while others contribute far less effort. If this imbalance continues, the functioning of the entire group may eventually suffer. For this reason, the effects of protection and indulgence go far beyond shaping an individual's character or ability. Over time, they also influence the structure of relationships and environments. Protection tends to encourage growth and trust, while indulgence often delays problems and allows them to accumulate. By recognizing these effects, we can make clearer and more thoughtful choices when we encounter similar situations in our own lives. In real life, most people do not deliberately set out to indulge others. More often, they simply struggle to find the right balance between care and responsibility. Sometimes we just want to help someone through a difficult moment, or avoid creating conflict within a relationship. Yet, without realizing it, our help can slowly turn into taking on everything for the other person. For this reason, learning to recognize whether our actions are protective or indulgent is extremely important. One useful question to ask is this: does my help make the other person more capable? If the support we offer helps someone understand the problem, learn new ways of dealing with it, and gradually more able to handle similar situations in the future, then that help is likely closer to genuine protection. On the other hand, if every problem always requires the same person to step in and solve it, while the other person never has the opportunity or the willingness to learn and change, then the situation may already be moving towards indulgence. Another important factor to observe is whether responsibility still remains in place. In situations of protection, even when someone receives support, the person who acted still has to face the consequences of their behavior. They may need to acknowledge a mistake, correct their actions, or accept certain costs resulting from their decisions. Through this process, people begin to understand the connection between actions and outcomes. But if every consequence is consistently absorbed by someone else, responsibility gradually shifts away from the person who should carry it. This is one of the most common signs of indulgence. Emotions can also strongly influence our judgment. When we see someone feeling upset or frustrated because of a mistake, it is natural to want to relieve their pain immediately. However, if every uncomfortable feeling is removed too quickly, it becomes difficult for people to learn from experience. Protection does not mean eliminating all difficulty. Rather, it means offering support when difficulties arise, allowing someone to understand the situation and grow without being overwhelmed. Another helpful way to reflect is by observing how the relationship itself changes over time. If a relationship causes someone to become increasingly dependent on another person's decisions and actions, to the point where they gradually lose the ability to judge situations or take responsibility, then that relationship may be leaning towards indulgence. By contrast, if support and assistance gradually help a person become more confident in making decisions and more willing to take responsibility for their choices, the relationship is more likely to represent healthy protection. It can also be useful to examine the motivation behind our help. Sometimes people avoid setting boundaries because they fear conflict or worry that the relationship might suffer. If the main purpose of helping is simply to avoid uncomfortable conversations rather than to support the other person's growth, then that behavior may need to be reconsidered. Genuine protection sometimes involves difficult conversations. Yet, these conversations often help relationships grow stronger and more mature. By reflecting on these different perspectives, people can begin to understand their own actions more clearly. Distinguishing between protection and indulgence is not always easy. It requires ongoing reflection and adjustment. But when we are willing to ask whether our help truly encourages growth, we are far more likely to find a healthy balance between care and responsibility. When protection and indulgence are confused in personal relationships, the impact is usually limited to a small number of people. But when this confusion extends into social issues, the consequences can become far more significant. In public discussions, the way we define ideas shapes how we understand fairness, responsibility, and social systems. If a society cannot clearly distinguish between protection and indulgence, practices that should be questioned may end up being accepted under seemingly legitimate reasons. In many social debates, fairness is often presented as a central goal. To ensure that people from different backgrounds have reasonable opportunities, societies create policies and systems designed to provide support. In itself, this is not a problem. Genuine fairness sometimes does require protection, especially to ensure that disadvantaged groups are not excluded simply because of circumstances beyond their control. However, difficulties arise when boundaries begin to disappear. If, in the pursuit of fairness, every behavior is treated as something that must be justified or excused, protection can gradually turn into indulgence. When unreasonable or irresponsible actions are consistently overlooked, or even explained as something that must be tolerated, society may unintentionally allow unfairness to persist. On the surface, this may appear to be a form of compassion or tolerance. Yet, at a deeper level, it can weaken the meaning of the rules themselves. An even more complicated situation occurs when indulgence is presented as protection. When certain practices are described as necessary for achieving fairness, people may become more willing to accept them, even if those practices no longer maintain responsibility or clear boundaries. Once indulgence is labeled as protection, the problem becomes much harder to recognize. From the outside, a system may appear to be helping particular groups, But in practice, it may gradually create an imbalance in how responsibility is shared. If this situation continues, society's sense of fairness can begin to erode. People who continue to follow the rules may start to feel that they are carrying a greater burden, while others are allowed to ignore the same standards. Over time, trust in institutions and systems may slowly decline. And when trust weakens, the rules that once helped maintain order become more difficult to respect. This is why blurring the line between protection and indulgence can have such a powerful impact on social issues. When indulgence is presented as protection in the name of fairness, society may appear to be pursuing justice on the surface, while in reality creating new forms of imbalance. As rules and responsibilities are reinterpreted, society can gradually drift away from the goals it originally hoped to achieve. For this reason, clearly understanding the difference between protection and indulgence is especially important when discussing social issues. True protection provides support while still maintaining responsibility and boundaries. In this way, systems can both assist those who genuinely need help and preserve fairness for everyone. Only when these two elements exist together can fairness become more than just a slogan, and instead become a principle that is genuinely put into practice. The difference between protection and indulgence is not always easy to recognize on the surface. In many situations, both may appear to come from care or good intentions. Yet the outcomes they produce can be very different. True protection maintains boundaries even while offering support. It allows people to learn how to take responsibility and face reality, while still knowing that they are not alone. Through this balance, individuals can gradually develop the strength and confidence to deal with challenges on their own. Indulgence, however, can slowly weaken responsibility beneath the appearance of kindness. When consequences are repeatedly softened or removed, problems may be ignored rather than addressed. Over time, they may even grow larger or more difficult to resolve. For this reason, understanding the difference between protection and indulgence is important in many areas of life. Whether in personal relationships, family education, or discussions about wider social issues. Ultimately, what matters most is finding a balance between care and principle. When compassion is combined with clear boundaries and responsibility, protection can truly serve its purpose. And only under those conditions can fairness be genuinely maintained. That's all for this video. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Every like, subscribe, and comment are a contribution to solving those difficult questions. I look forward to your joining our discussion and making a contribution to solving the difficult questions. Once again, thank you for your watching. Goodbye!